Hey, everybody. We are back for another episode of the Supply Chain Solutions ShipSo series. Today is April 13th, 2023, and this is episode 13 in our yearly series. We have a great show for you in store today, and we have a special guest joining us who will give us a sort of a master class in all things related to freight rail and intermodal logistics. But before we introduce our guest, Jason, what's happening? How are you?
I'm doing great, Anthony. Honestly, the sun is shining. We are finally seeing some great weather. I did just get an indication that snow is coming in 5 days, even though it's 75 right now. Apparently, we haven't had our last snow yet. But that's okay. It's sun shining. It's fantastic right now.
Oh my God, I can't believe that. That's incredible. Well, everyone, please join me in welcoming Barbara Ann Cataneo. Barbara is a graduate of Loyola College, and she is the secretary of the board of directors of the Private Railcar Food and Beverage Association of America. She has received numerous accolades throughout her career, is the recipient of the Strategic Client Directors Award, Chairman's Club, and is also a Ring of Honor recipient for sales and logistics. We've had a long relationship, Barbara and I. We used to work together, and she has been in logistics for the last 35 years and is truly amazing. So today, Barbara will talk about freight rail in the 21st century. So, Barb,
Hi.
welcome to the ship show.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Jason. It's great to be here. I appreciate this opportunity to share one of my favorite subjects, which is the freight rail industry. It's a very unique aspect of supply chain, which a lot of companies don't spend a lot of time working on because they think it's difficult, which it is. It's not easy. But when you find a partner such as Supply Chain Solutions that can help manage your freight rail, it's really not that hard. But there's a lot of nuances surrounding the freight rail business. And I want to kind of go a little bit of the history of railroading just to kind of bring you up to where we are today, which is not where we should be. There's a lot of work going on in Washington, D.C. today to try to roll things back a little bit. But let me kind of start out by telling you how this all started. So in 1830, the first track was laid and actually was laid in Baltimore. So if anyone ever has the opportunity to visit Baltimore, Maryland, there is a museum here called the B&O Railroad Museum, and it is 40 acres of locomotives and freight cars and all kinds of stuff from every era of railroading. And it gives you a great history of what took place. And the actual rock where the first track was laid is in the museum because it was
Wow.
here in Baltimore. So it's really kind of cool.
Oh,
So yeah, really, really cool. I've been in the rail industry myself off and on in intermodal and then freight rail. I was 11 years in the intermodal arena, and then I was 9 years in freight rail, which are two very different things. Intermodal is your truck train type of service. Your freight rail is actually box cars and different types of equipment. In the scenario of freight rail, you need to have siding at your facility to load and unload those rail cars. There's no trucks involved. So it's really important that if you're shipping freight rail, find out if your origin destination facilities are rail served. And that's stuff that I do every day. So if anybody on this call ever needs help with that, I can certainly assist. But that's what makes it so economical, because you're just putting it directly onto a rail car and you're not having to unload and transload. So with the history of railroading, the first transcontinental railroad actually started in 1880. And at that point in the history of railroading, there was only 93,000 miles of track laid at that time. So if you talk about the golden years of railroading, that was actually 1916, and there was about 243,000 tracks. Now here we are, 2023. We've only got about 140,000 tracks. So what happened? Railroads merged. You had probably 40 or 50 railroads in the United States back in the 1970s. Now you have 4 railroads in the United States. You have 2 on the East Coast, 2 on the West Coast, which are the Burlington Northern, Santa Fe, which goes by the BNSF on the West Coast and the Union Pacific, which goes by UP on the West Coast. On the East Coast, you have the CSX Railroad and the Norfolk Southern. And that's it. You have the KCS, which is the Kansas City Southern, which is kind of the Midwest Railroad. But there's been approval given by the Surface Transportation Board recently, as in like the last 2 months, where the Canadian Pacific Railroad in Canada is actually buying the KCS. So you're going to ask a question, Jason?
I got a big question about that. Oh my,
Sure.
I literally just had to quick type something in to double check this because I wanted to ask you about this. What's your opinion on that merger?
So my opinion is if it had been the CN, it wouldn't be as good for the rail shipper. So being that it's the CP, it's a little bit better because it will offer some competition. Generally, I do not support mergers because it really lessens the competitive posture for the rail shipper. And the Private Railcar Food and Beverage Association is about helping the rail shipper manage and navigate railroading. If you don't have options, it's not a great thing for the rail shipper. So if we were going to pick one of the two, I was happier that the CP was given authority by the Surface Transportation Board as opposed to the CN, only because the tracks that the CP has that tie in with the KCS make it a better option for rail shippers. So
That's really interesting, huh, Jay?
Oh,
Yeah.
well, and the thing that really blew my mind about that merger and why I just want to talk about it as well is just the fact that now we've got a Canada, US, and Mexico connection.
correct.
And I love the idea that there's, it's obviously not one company the way they're set up, but still there is a one-ish company now transit that could go between all three. So I'm excited for anything that encourages cross-border trade.
Absolutely.
I like that idea. Sorry about that.
In Canada, there's two railroads, the Canadian National and the Canadian Pacific. And in fact, I'm having dinner with the Canadian National next Tuesday night in Montreal. And there's in Mexico, there's two railroads, the FXE and the Kansas City Southern Mexico. With this merger with this the CP, you're now going to have service legitimately from Canada through the US all the way into Mexico on the KCSM. So you will have that direct service, which will be really cool. And I think it's going to open up a lot of options for rail shippers to be able to have that service. It's difficult because there's no transcontinental railroad in the United States today. So your CSX and your NS are going to meet up in either Chicago, St. Louis, Memphis, any of the gateway points with the BN and the UP on the West Coast, but there is no transcontinental railroad. And then at that point, they hand off the traffic and they send it to the other railroad. So it's a little different with the Canadian to Mexico because you will have basically one carrier. Which ought to be interesting. So in the US, we call the fact that we have the two class ones on each coast a duopoly. So it's 2 and 2. It's a weird word because everybody always says monopoly, but the duopoly is having two each on each coast. So as I mentioned, there's about 140,000 miles of track today, down 100,000 over 100 years ago. And someone asked me how much traffic moves on railroads. So in 2022, 1.7 billion tons of traffic moved on the railroads. Now, if you were to look at that and say from a rail car, a carload standpoint. So let me tell you a little bit about carloads. Carloads are roughly 3.5 truckloads. So for every carload, you can typically get 3.5 trucks worth of freight in a rail car.
Wow.
In 2022, the U.S. railroads handled 11,976,000 carloads. 11,976,000 carloads, which would have been about 42 million trucks.
That's staggering.
That is staggering. Can you imagine trying to get drivers under 42 million truckloads? We have a driver shortage today, and it's estimated by, I think, Bob Costello from the American Trucking Association stated that I think by 2028, we're going to be 155,000 drivers short. This is why railroading is so important. Whether it's intermodal or freight rail, shippers really need to look at their entire supply chain to see what other options they have. And if they don't have siding at their shipping facility or the receiving facility, it's always good to talk about what warehouses do have siding where you can do transloading. So that's still an option.
Jason, go ahead. Go ahead.
So explain to the shippers about siding. If they don't have siding, if they want to have siding, just explain that whole idea, because we've talked to numerous companies that have wanted to hook up to freight rail, but they just didn't know how. And just dive into that.
So, back in the 1930s and the 40s, every production facility had rail siding for the most part in the US. And then over the years, as containerization became more popular in the 60s and 70s, a lot of companies started saying, well, we really aren't going to ship freight rail anymore. We're going to just ship intermodal. And what we found is a lot of production facilities ended up putting asphalt over their tracks. And so now here in 2023, they're saying, well, I want to ship freight rail. It's more economical. It's definitely a cost savings, probably up to about 40% of what a truck would cost. So, I mean, there's tremendous savings with shipping freight rail, but a lot of companies find themselves stuck because their shipping facilities don't have rail. So there's a couple of things you can do. You can go to a third-party warehouse, maybe truck it down the street if that third-party facility has siding, or you can work with the railroad that did service your facility in the past, because the railroads are offering incentives now, and they will actually help to fund putting tracks back in if it makes sense for them and the volume is there and all the important factors. And your state will also, and your city will sometimes offer incentives to put tracks back in as well. So there's a lot of different things that can be done to get the freight rail tracks put back in place.
That's very insightful, a comment there and perspective, Barb. And as you continue on with your presentation later on, try to give us a little perspective of the dichotomy between that whole federal maritime versus the STB, and as you move towards that. But go ahead.
Yeah, so freight rail or railroads are governed by an agency called the Surface Transportation Board. The Surface Transportation Board is not a part of the U.S. Department of Transportation. They are a separate independent agency that was formed in 1996. So prior to the STB coming into existence, the Interstate Commerce Commission was managing and overseeing the railroads up until about 1995, when they were kind of abolished, right? And the reason they were abolished in 1995 is because we had this thing called the Staggers Act that was passed in 1980. So in 1980, Harley Staggers, or Congressman Harley Staggers said, you know what, the railroads are struggling financially. We need to do something to help them. And at the time, 43 years ago, it made sense. And what they did was they deregulated the railroads, and they made a lot of regulations that were around supporting the railroads and making them better financially healthy, right? Now, fast forward to 2023, and a lot of those regulations now are detrimental to the rail shipper. So the railroads today have a lot of power. They have a lot of control, and they're able to get away with things that most businesses wouldn't be able to do just because of these regulations. So the Surface Transportation Board, while there's 5 commissioners on the board, and they oversee the regulations and the policies for railroading, they don't have as much power as the FMC. The FMC has way more power over the steamship lines than the STB has over the railroads. And it's just because of the way the regulations were written and the authorization when they created the STB in 1996. They didn't want them to have too much control over the railroads because they didn't want them to choke the railroads from being successful financially. There's no question that in 1979, the railroads were about to go under. There's no question. What happened in 1980 and what Harley Staggers did was important, but the times have changed, and railroading is no longer in favor of the customer, the rail shipper. It is definitely in favor of the railroads. So whereas steamship lines offer competition, so if you want to ship with Maersk or APL or whoever, you have those options to be able to ask if they service the same areas. Mm-hmm. Well, with railroading, the tracks are the tracks, and the railroads own the tracks. So if you're serviced by the CSX in Baltimore, you can't go to the NS and ask them for a rate. It just doesn't exist. So you're stuck with whatever railroad services your facility. Now there are policies and requests that have been put in front of Congress as well as in front of the STB to change some of the regulations and water them down a little bit so that the rail shipper has some more advantages. One of them is called reciprocal switching. So the thought is, if my facility is serviced by the CSX, but I want to get a quote from the NS, why can't I do that? Why wouldn't I be able to have competitive pricing? So there is, unfortunately, it's been in front of the STB since 2011.
Yeah.
And it has not been passed yet. We are pushing the Private Railcar Food and Beverage Association has been pushing for these proceedings to be, approved and put into practice. But it's very heavy focused on railroading and the railroads and not the rail shippers. So we keep pushing this with Congress, with the Senate. The Senate Commerce Commission is the one that oversees the STB. I personally have gone in front of the Senate and asked them to please revisit the regulations around railroading to make it more fair for rail shippers. I'm actually going to be having dinner with the vice chairman of the STB next week. Karen Headland is going to be in Montreal for this conference. So we're going to be talking about how do you make the environment better for rail shippers?
Yeah.
Yeah. And Barb, just real quick to digress, again, that Staggers Act, just to touch on that again, as you so eloquently did, that act legalized railroad shipper contracts, and the contracts represented privately negotiated agreements between railroads and shippers over rates and service levels and equipment and minimal annual volume of traffic, just to name a few. So,
right.
That all unfolded at the end of the Carter administration in 79, 80. So, I was really great to see. I had a sneak peek of your presentation, and it's just great that you touched on staggers. But why don't you continue on with your presentation today for our audience?
So there was a couple changes that took place in 2017. So railroading was doing okay up until 14, 15, and 16. We had some blips in the U.S. with some service issues because of snowstorms and whatnot in the West Coast in 2014 that caused some delays and some problems. But then in 2017, things really took a turn. And what that was about was what's called precision scheduled railroading, or PSR. So PSR was implemented at CSX in 2017 by Hunter Harrison, who was the then chairman of the CSX Railroad. He had actually implemented the same methodology in Canada at the Canadian National Railroad back in the 90s, and had brought this methodology to the US and started it with CSX. A rail shipper does not think it's a great methodology. If you ask any rail shipper, they're going to say since 2017, service has gone downhill. And the reason is, and I happen to agree, if you talk to the railroads, they'll tell you differently. They think it's great, but it has, yes, made the railroads from an operating ratio standpoint very efficient. However, what they did was they closed a lot of the serving yards. They extended the train length. So train lengths are right about a mile and a half now. I mean, imagine sitting at a railroad crossing and waiting for a train to go through that's a mile and a half long.
Yeah.
That's going to take probably 20 minutes.
Insane.
Sure.
And the communities that these sidings or these interchange points are, people are up in arms because they have these. Well, we all saw what happened in East Palatine, Ohio, with the Norfolk Southern derailment. These kinds of things are becoming more prevalent because the railroads made these changes in 2017. It started with the CSX, then it bled over to the NS, then it bled over to the Union Pacific. Now, the BN is the only railroad that did not fully embrace PSR. They decided to just put a toe in, but they didn't go all in, which thank goodness, because I think their service is better than some of the other railroads. But making the longer trains, doing away with the serving yards and having trains run straight through has really created a problem. And then the other challenge is that Each train has a conductor and an engineer. So there's 2 people crews. That's it. That's all. So so as part of the challenge has been that if you have a 2-person crew working a train, can they actually do a thorough job of inspecting for safety and other issues? So that's a number one concern. The second concern is if you have a 2-person crew and they don't show up on a particular day, then you can't move the train. You got to try to find somebody else to come in, and that's not an easy feat either, which is something that the railroads have been struggling with, which is labor. So back in the 1900s, early 1900s, probably all the way up through the 60s, working for the railroad was a very prestigious job to have.
Sure.
Not anymore. People don't want to work for the railroad. And the reason is, in my opinion, this is all my opinion, is that they work for them. They all got laid off in 2017 as a result of PSR because they had a lot of furloughs back then because they were lessening the number of people. They were extending the train length. They were doing away with servicing yards. So all these things changed. They furloughed a lot of people. Then 2020 hit and we had the pandemic and they furloughed and laid off a lot more people. So now the railroads are scrambling because in 21, the business came back with a vengeance, way more business than anybody was expecting. And they didn't have the people to manage the railroads. So you literally had trains that were sitting for days and weeks in some cases, and rail cars not getting delivered because they didn't have anybody to work the train. So now they've been putting in promotions for the last 2 years to hire people, marketing, and trying to incent people to come work for the railroad. But just like working in cold storage, if anybody's ever worked in a cold storage warehouse, that's a tough job to be in a frozen warehouse at negative, 10 degrees, 8 or 10 hours a day. Well, the railroad folks are working outside all day long in all kinds of weather. And it's a difficult thing to attract people, especially today's generation. The folks graduating from high school and college are not saying, I want to be a railroader, and they're not saying, I want to be a trucker either. So we have this whole aspect of our labor that is suffering because people don't want to do those jobs anymore. And it is really the infrastructure of our economy is the railroading employees and also the truckers, right? So we've got to find a way to bring that back.
Yeah.
Jason, any comments or?
Oh man. Okay. A few things. So first of all, and I'm going to go, let's see here. Let me ask this one first. So with the railroad union negotiations that just went on, do you feel like that's going to change the labor situation, or do you think it's going to kind of keep the railroads, I don't know, kind of in stalemate, right? Because you were kind of, and this kind of bleeds into another question. You were earlier talking about the idea of being able to quote with another carrier just to kind of break up that duopoly a little bit. But do you think with these new incentives and this new higher pay scale and sick day scale, do you think that's going to slow down some of those other incentives? But also, do you think it's going to bring a little more labor to the railroads?
My honest answer is no.
Yeah.
I don't think that I think it was what happened in September, October when they finally agreed. I'm not even sure, and I have to double check, but I don't even think all the unions have actually ratified yet. I think there were still some that hadn't. They were forced by the government to take the deal. And that's, imagine if you were forced to do something, right? You're going to do it because you have no other choice, but is it really where your heart is? And is it really what you want? If you talk to management at the railroads, they feel that the deal that the employees got was good. But if you talk to the actual workers, and I have done that, they feel being on call all the time, not being able to, some of these guys can't even leave their district to go anywhere, even personally, because if they get called in to have to cover a shift, they have to be there. That's a tough way to live. So yes, they were given some interesting, incentives and whatnot. The 24% increase, I think, is over 5 years. Everybody thought initially, it's a 24% increase in one. No, it's over 5 years. And they had to give up some stuff still. They're not getting everything that they wanted, especially the sick leave. I don't believe they get paid for sick leave, which was one of the issues that they were having, problems with. So I think it was a temporary fix. I don't think we're going to see another strike or any threat of a strike for a couple of years, but was it the answer to the problem? No.
Yeah.
I don't think so.
Barb, in our last 5 minutes of the show, why don't you tell us what you think is in store for the remainder of 2023? And I know it's a very broad question. And what do you think is, how do you think it's going to unfold as we move out of 23 and into 24 with rail?
So, I absolutely, what I see is the railroads are fighting hard to get business back. Their volume has fallen off over the last couple of years because of service. When you load a rail car and it doesn't get delivered, I mean, typically from West Coast to East Coast, it's about 21 days. But when you load a rail car of food and it doesn't get delivered for 2 or 3 months, that's a problem, right? Because there's a
Yep.
shelf life typically, even if it's
Sure.
frozen. The railroads are fighting hard to come back. I met with a couple, well, actually met with all the railroads in California a couple weeks ago at a conference, met with them individually, and we talked about what are you doing? They are absolutely trying to bring in the labor. They're doing all these incentives to increase the volume of the employee headcount. They are looking at service. And it's interesting because what happened in 2017 and the same thing that happened with the CN in Canada is after they implemented PSR, now they're rolling it back a little bit, right? Now they're saying maybe we went too far. Maybe we went too close to the bone. Maybe we need to revisit the service because so many rail customers are complaining about service.
Mhm.
And now they have to take a step back and say, what are they going to do different? They're all committed to hiring more people, improving service, and providing some better metrics and data to be able to track. And real quick, I know we have 3 minutes left. The railroads report their data on their performance to the STB quarterly, and it's based on the trip plan versus what they actually do. But that's not a really good way to measure because the trip plan is typically from interchange point, say Chicago, to interchange point, say Baltimore. It's not necessarily from the Baltimore serving yard to the actual door delivery where the customer receives the freight.
Mhm.
That is where we have the problem. That last mile, first mile, last mile.
Mhm.
And if you measure that data, the service is horrible.
Yeah.
But that's not what they provide to the STB. They only provide the interchange to interchange point, and it looks like they're 98% on time. Well, okay, you can get it into the rail facility, the serving yard in Baltimore on Monday, but if you don't deliver it for 2 weeks because you don't have a crew to work the train, that's not really on time.
Yeah.
So we are seeing them now step back, the railroads, and they're saying, you know what, we got to improve service. We've got to find ways to improve the overall process because what we implemented in 2017, part of it works, but not all of it.
So, gosh,
Barbara, amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, we can't thank you enough for being part of the ship show today. Your outlook on rail in the 21st century was refreshing, intuitive, informative, and we definitely want to have you back as a guest. You are definitely a guru when it comes to all things rail. Jason, why don't you give us some closing comments before we go back to Barb?
I'm echoing everything you're saying, Anthony. And now I've got like 12 things I want to talk about around this. I'm like, oh, rail. Like we gotta have a whole show on PSR, quite frankly.
Right.
Because
Yeah.
I remember back in 2017 when what year did UP make the switch to PSR? Because I remember when UP started doing
2018.
it 2018, because that's when I started really seeing a bunch of articles pop out.
Yep.
And yeah, I just feel like okay. I can't get into it because we don't have time, but Barbara, thank you so much. Seriously, a wealth of information. We really appreciate it.
Barb, any closing comments? Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say one thing. I think freight rail should be a part of everybody's supply chain. You really need to look at your business and, reach out to an expert, whether it's Anthony or Jason, myself, however we can help you. But it's not easy, but the benefits are tremendous. And I'm telling you, you can save 40%, 20 to 40% on your freight expense. Plus, it's 7 times more efficient from a CO2 emission standpoint, and it's 4 times more efficient to ship by rail than truck from a fuel standpoint. So there's so many reasons to do it. I know it's daunting because it seems like it's difficult, but with experts out there, you can get it done, and it will really complement your supply chain.
Amazing.
Barbara, thank you. This was truly a masterclass in rail. And Jason, well, folks, listen, Don't forget, next week, it's the FMR. Jason's going to be traveling, the Freight Market Roundup. I'll be hosting next week's show on my own. I'm looking forward to it. And Jay, what do we usually say?
Make it a great week, right?
Make it a great week, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Barb.
Have
Thank
a
you
great
all.
week. Thank you.
Bye-bye now.